So, welcome everybody. My name is Jonathan Porritt. I'm founder director of Forum for the Future, one of the organizations that has been very closely involved in organizing Big Green Week. We're heading towards the end of that, and I'll say a bit more about that later. So thanks to Triodos, who's one of our sponsors, and of course to Good Energy and Wessex Water as well. Thank you very much. Right, well look, we're in for a bit of a feast this evening, okay, because we've got three fantastic speakers, all of whom have got a lot to contribute to the very topical debates about where green politics is going, how we can reflect some of these very big picture issues as they relate to ordinary people pursuing ordinary lives and not necessarily caught up in the green world to the extent that some of you might be. And I only say that because I do want to keep the focus this evening, if we can, on politics and ethics. We're not just going to be doing the political bit, we're also going to try and get to grips with this whole ethical story. So just to tease that out for you, how is it that we still live in a society here in the UK that is profoundly, systemically unequal, where social injustices seem to have become permanent, where most politicians seem to have got used to that, as if injustice is the new normal? How we cope with that ethically, surrounded, as it were, by the constancy of grotesque inequality in our society? That's one dimension. The second dimension is, how do we deal with this bit at the heart of sustainable development, what is often called intergenerational justice, living today without screwing things up for tomorrow? That's my colloquial definition. Brunton's is rather more elegant, obviously. But how do we do this intergenerational stuff? Because right now we're living as if tomorrow can just go hang, and we really don't have to worry about it. But we're very bad at bringing those intergenerational, the voice of the future, into our current decisions. And lastly, in terms of this big troika of concerns, ethical concerns, I hope we can touch on this evening, how do we reflect better the rights and interests of other species on this planet, so that we become more mindful of the totality of nature in the way in which we conduct ourselves as the dominant species in nature. All big and tricky issues, as you know. Is that okay, speakers? Good, excellent. So I'm just so delighted this evening to be able to introduce Caroline Lucas, Patrick Curry, and Polly Higgins, because this is a fantastic opportunity to hear from three people who are coping with these big picture ideas all the time and pursuing a very practical way of getting these ideas out to everybody else. I'm sure you all know Caroline. Caroline is still the leader of the Green Party, although by all accounts not necessarily for much longer, and has been absolutely formidable in that role, and I can say that with some feeling because I'm on the record as saying that I think the Green Party has been blessed by having a leader who could quite easily have been the leader of every single political party in this country, probably at the same time, and we still would have had a rather better situation. So that's my personal bias. Patrick has been very actively involved for a long time, and I've never met Patrick before, unless you're going to correct me, but I've read quite a lot of Patrick before, and in his work that he did while he was at Bath University and elsewhere, he's really helped people like me get to grips with some of this complicated territory about ecological ethics. He brought out a book last year, 2011, simply called Ecological Ethics, an Introduction, and it is really helpful. It's something that I found enormously valuable. And thirdly, Polly Higgins is going to speak at the end. Polly is now very involved with her Ecocide campaign, and I hope that some of you have heard a little bit about that. If you haven't, don't worry, you're going to hear about it this evening, which is a very powerful way of thinking about holding politicians and business leaders to account for what it is that they're doing or allowing to be done on their watch, as it were. And I was this afternoon lucky enough to be part of the Ecocide trial that some of Polly's colleagues down here in Bristol had organised on marine ecocide, where the Secretary of State in DEFRA was in the dock for the damage done to fishing around the UK. Apparently she's not guilty and not guilty, which was a hung verdict, but there we go. Polly may touch on that this evening. So this is the context. This is what we're hoping to cover this evening. Each of our speakers is going to talk for 15 minutes, and then I'm going to ask the other two speakers just to engage with the speaker for a little bit. just so that you get a little bit more interaction between our speakers. And then once we've done that, I'll come obviously to a broader Q&A. And Caroline's going first. And I'm going to have to get up on each occasion, but there we go.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, thank you so much for that introduction. I am absolutely delighted to be here. We've been asked to speak, as Jonathan said, about the politics and ethics of change, and I was just going to start by reflecting that you don't often hear those two words in the same sentence, and indeed the idea that that politics and ethics are compatible when you think about Westminster might sort of stretch your imaginations somewhat. At the height of the expenses scandal, I would say it would probably have struck most people as a fairly ludicrous proposition. Even before that, politics was held in pretty low esteem, not quite as low as estate agents, but pretty close to it. I was very honoured some years back to have won the Observer's Ethical Politician of the Year award, but as I pointed out at the time, there wasn't really very much opposition and competition. But the truth is that it matters. It really does matter that we have a politics that we can trust, that we have an ethical politics. And that means we need to reinvent politics to some extent and re-engage people again with the political process. Because without that political system, we are simply not going to get where we need to be fast enough in terms of having this transition to a genuinely sustainable economy. That doesn't mean to say that individuals and community groups don't matter. They matter massively, massively. And I particularly pay tribute to the transition town groups, for example, who I think do amazing work, not least in giving a bit of spine to some of those politicians to show them that people will support more ambitious policies. So those local organisations and community groups are massively important. But I think that if we're to make the transition as fast as we need to, if we're to scale up as quickly as we have to, then the notion that we can do that without an enabling policy framework set by politicians nationally, I think is cloud cuckoo land. I say nationally, I mean internationally too. We need that framework so we can get the right investment, we can get the right targets, we can get the right finances going where it needs to be. So I would argue that we're going to need some very courageous politicians, in fact, who are willing to expend some real political capital in making some pretty difficult decisions. Now, sadly, in terms of timing, the very time that I would argue that we need a more interventionist state, more ambitious politicians, is exactly the time when people are holding politicians in pretty much disrepute. And, of course, we've got a government that is pretty much hell-bent on shrinking the state as fast as it can. So that is a real paradox and makes it even more important, I think, that we recognise the importance of re-engaging people with that political system, because we're going to need some pretty strong state intervention, alongside lots of other interventions, yes, but that needs to be there too, if we're particularly, for example, to address the climate crisis with the speed that we need. And so in terms of reflecting on this issue of the politics and ethics of change, I thought I would talk a bit about my own experiences in Parliament as a way of exploring how our political processes need to be made more fit for purpose in terms of that change, as well as talking about some of the institutional changes that we need. Of course, I'll also touch on some of the policies that we need as well. So I can report to you that the first few months at Westminster as a new MP are pretty peculiar. Some people compare it to being at a new school, but actually at a new school you don't get the sense they've got a vested interest in not telling you what the rules are. Whereas in Westminster they don't like to tell you the rules until you've broken them, and then they come down and you're like a ton of bricks. The welcoming process was efficient. I had a minder even from the palace staff. Of less value but more period charm, I was also allocated a coat hook very early on with a pink ribbon on which to hold my sword. They still do that. So hanging my sword up was of no problem. Getting an office was slightly more complicated. Offices are allocated according to party size, the individual MP's seniority, and of course the whole system of patronage kicks in there as well. So if you play the game, if you vote the right way, if you sit on the committees that no one else wants to sit on, you might get an office with a view. I think troublemakers can expect a broom cupboard with limited ventilation. I was finally allocated the office that used to belong to Michael Mates after he stood down after over 30 years in Parliament. And there was a lovely story of how the Express told him who was in his old office, and the Express reported that he choked over his whiskey at the idea of this green woman in his office. And I imagine he thought I was going to be weaving my own yoghurt or living in a yurt or something, but some stereotypes die very hard indeed. But all of that does cause me to reflect on a serious point, which is that we need to have much greater diversity in our political system if we are to have any hope of re-engaging public support for it. You know, the campaign to win Brighton Pavilion took every last penny that the Green Party had, and so getting new parties and smaller parties into Parliament is a massively difficult task. Everything is still stacked hugely against it, whether we're talking about the electoral system itself or the fact that we still don't have any state funding for political parties. And if you were just to stand a Green MP in every single seat in the country, that would cost us over £300,000 in deposits alone. And you can imagine the first time we stand, we probably wouldn't necessarily win all those deposits, so that's a lot of money that's gone. That issue of state funding for political parties, you know, the other politicians will say, well, maybe we should get round to it at some point, but actually right now isn't a good time to ask people to spend more money. And I would contest that, actually. I mean, times go by when people send soldiers out to fight wars in the name of democracy. And if we're really suggesting that people aren't prepared to spend 50p a year in order to support their democracy, then I think that probably tells us more about what's wrong with our democracy than it does about people's willingness to pay for it. So we need to change the voting system. We need to change the finances so that smaller parties can get in, because right now it feels as if the whole system is stacked against those alternative voices being heard. Indeed, if politics was a business, and I sometimes wonder whether that isn't not such a far-fetched idea, but if politics were a business, it would be a prime case for a referral to the Competition Commission for monopolistic collusion in excluding new entrants to the market. So diversity is deliberately kept out, and let's give one example, which is perhaps less deliberate but still very important, was about gender. We still have a situation in our mother of parliaments where women are just 1 in 5 of the MPs. The UK is ranked 48th in the world in terms of parliamentary representation of women. In percentage terms, that puts us behind leading democracies like Afghanistan and Rwanda. And this isn't just a matter of natural justice. I think it undermines the quality of the lawmaking and the scrutiny that politicians are doing, and it means that a different view, again, is not being properly represented in our decision-making process. Meanwhile, other countries with a more balanced political class can debate the merits much more calmly, bring in more sensible rules. My proposal, for example, to suggest some job sharing for MPs was met with some surprise, shall we say. And yet you could argue that that would be a really concrete way of probably enabling more women to take part in Parliament. So I could go on all evening about how the whole Westminster system is set up for the convenience of the power brokers, about how hostile it is to change. I could talk for hours about how the majority of MPs have absolutely no idea what they're voting on for the majority of the time, how we can't possibly debate all amendments because it takes 20 minutes to do each vote, because we all have to file through the aye lobby and the no lobby, and don't even think about abstaining because you literally can't. If you want to abstain, the only way to do it is not to vote at all, in which case all of those helpful websites that follow whether or not your MP is present will simply say you weren't present, or you can vote in both the aye lobby and the no lobby, which means you get reported as being extremely confused. And again, that matters because I would argue that it prevents MPs from registering that there are viable alternatives to full support or outright opposition, and it's symptomatic of a parliamentary system which is based on this two-party conflict. This adversarial system impacts on everything from the membership of select committees, one of the most effective tools for parliamentary scrutiny, to the selection for amendments for debate. The Conservative MP for Totnes, Sarah Wollaston, famously tells the story of how she was denied a seat on the Health and Social Care Bill Committee because she had perhaps naively admitted that there were a couple of amendments that she was hoping to put. Now here she was, a GP, a doctor, who she believes was elected by the people of Totnes partly because of her specialism on health, and she was not allowed to be on the committee that was going to be debating the very important health bill that's just been going through Parliament. Instead, she was asked to sit on the committee for double taxation in the Oman. And when she reasonably pointed out that she knew very little about single taxation in the UK, let alone double taxation in the Oman, she received a note from the whips to say that her only duties were to turn up on time, to say nothing, and to vote with the government, which is hardly the most compelling job description for a member of a parliamentary committee. When I introduced a short report, ambitiously called The Case for Parliamentary Reform after a few months in Parliament, Margaret Beckett took me aside and said, "Don't be in such a hurry, you'll get used to it." At which point I replied, that is exactly the problem. You have all got used to it. You have become institutionalised. And the reason that I'm telling you all of this is because not only are those flaws in our parliamentary process frustrating, inefficient, time-wasting and energy-draining, they are undemocratic and unaccountable. And crucially, as far as tonight's debate is concerned, they are completely inimical to any serious debate and decision-making about the greatest threat that we face today, the growing environmental crisis. I think there's a very real risk that our political system, based on adversarial, binary opposition, on short-termism and corporate vested interest, will mean that we're incapable of taking the necessary action to ensure that we have a livable planet into the future. And nowhere is that clearer than in our inability, really, of our current political system to consider the impacts of politics, not just in the next focus group, not just for the next month or year, but for the next 50 years or for the next 500 years. As Edmund Burke said over 200 years ago, society is a partnership not only between those now living, but between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are yet to be born. More recently, the World Commission on Environment and Development, the Brundtland Commission, back in 1987 observed, "We act as we do because we can get away with it. We act as we do because we can get away with it. Future generations don't vote. They have no political or financial power. They cannot challenge our decisions." And in spite of almost all governments adopting the Brundtland definition of sustainable development that explicitly recognises the rights of future generations, we have no parliamentary way of properly operationalising what that means in practice. And that prevents long-termism and the needs of those as yet unborn from being brought into the heart of our democratic and policy processes. Now, there are models where people are beginning to think about how do we grapple with this problem. And so, for example, there's been a legal study that has identified 17 countries where future generations have been recognised constitutionally. In Hungary, for example, which in many ways is not a great model right now of progressive politics, but nonetheless the administration before the one that's there now did introduce a parliamentary commissioner for future generations, a kind of green ombudsperson, and their role was exactly to investigate organisational and functional maladministration relating to the environment, but also to scrutinise every single piece of policy going through Parliament from the perspective of future generations and to be able to stop things if necessary. So that is the kind of model that we can perhaps think about. Now, if I sound impatient with institutional obstacles to swift action to address the multiple environmental crises that we face, then it's because I am deeply impatient. I think the whole debate tonight is incredibly urgent. We don't have forever to get it right. You know, the Rio Earth Summit was 20 years ago, and in that 20 years, I think we can frankly say that we've wasted a huge amount of time. Meanwhile, scientists tell us that literally the next 6 to 10 years are going to be crucial in terms of whether or not we get the political will to get off the kind of collision course we're on with the climate catastrophe, or whether or not we garner that political will to stop monitoring our own extinction, but to take some concrete action to avoid it. So this Parliament and the one after it, and you in this room and people in similar rooms around this country and around the world, right now we have an enormous responsibility. It is an awesome responsibility, but it's also, I think, an extraordinary opportunity as well. I don't know how many of you have seen that film, The Age of Stupid, which is based on the idea that Pete Postlethwaite is there as someone in 2050 after some huge climate catastrophe, and he's looking back to today, and he goes through real existing newsreels, TV stuff and so on, and he says, why is it, knowing what we knew then, we didn't act when we still had time? And you know, just saying that still gets the hairs going up on the back of my neck, because that to me is the most important question that we face. What is it that's stopping us from being able to act? And I think there are a range of things that we could cite. We have a government that has claimed it's going to be the greenest government ever. I don't know how party political we can be, but I think even with that fairly low bar, because the governments before it were pretty pitiful, they're doing pretty badly. If I had more time, I would be talking about the way in which, for example, they are slashing funding for renewables. You know that they're moving away from targets on energy efficiency and so on. And they are basically very, very much listening to the interests of companies, the corporate interest, and not to citizens' interest. We have an economy that is based on more and more economic growth. And yet, the bottom line is that on a planet of finite resources, we cannot go growing infinitely. And to take the ethical point on that, of course, countries in the south, developing countries, poorer countries, are the ones that need some growth right now, which means we have even more of a responsibility here in the rich world to be able to reduce our consumption patterns, to reduce our impact on the earth, to give them more space to develop. And yes, efficiency is going to make a big difference. And yes, technology change will be part of that as well, but behaviour change is going to be part of that too. And so when we ask ourselves, well, why is it that we know all of that? It's not that there's something we don't know. We know the transition that we need to make. Why are we not doing it? Then I think I'll end by saying that what we really need to do is to be much better at painting an attractive picture of what a green society and a green economy really looks like. I think the green movement as a whole, and I include the Green Party in that, in the past has been too busy just trying to wake people up about the fact that we are walking towards a catastrophe, and so we've written ever more tightly focused leaflets and we've got more and more anxious and cross. What we haven't done is to reflect that actually what motivates behaviour a lot better is to be talking about the kind of green society we want to see and what it will be like in tangible terms, to talk about the fact there'll be kids playing in the streets again, to talk about the fact we're more likely to have time with our families and friends. You know, not many people on their deathbed look back on their life and think, my God, I wish I'd spent more time in the office. You know, they're more likely to think more time with friends and family and doing what they love is the way that they could have spent their life. So the man in the front is telling me to wind up, so I shall. But just to say that I think the real challenge in terms of moving us towards that ethical and political change that we need to see is not to present it to people as another burden. It's not about shivering around a candle in a cave. It is about a way of life that is likely to be an awful lot more fulfilling, as well as less damaging to the environment as well. Thank you.
Caroline, thank you very much. Patrick, just very quickly, have you given up on the whole concept of ethical politicians, or are you still hoping that this is a phenomenon we might see more of?
One sitting next to me, how could I possibly give
So
up
any
on
thoughts on what Caroline's been saying?
There's a whole nest of problems, of course. One of them that occurs to me is, given that, I agree with basically everything you said, of course. That doesn't mean there aren't problems. And one of them is, somebody once said you cannot have a steady state economy without a steady state culture to support it. And I wonder, even if how are we going to change the institutions without the groundswell of popular support, to a certain extent at any rate, to support those changes? Now, what would you attribute that current lack of groundswell to? Is it simply a matter of education, or, to put it bluntly, ignorance? Or is there a sort of bedrock resistance that actually is more intractable than that?
I think I would take a slightly more optimistic view of where people are at right now anyway. I think there are some interesting trends, like, for example, once people are earning a certain amount, and I absolutely take the point they've got to be able to afford to do it, but once they're earning a certain amount, then when they're offered the opportunity between more money or more time off, they choose a slightly more balanced life. I think there is something that a lot of people would recognise, to say that that many of our lives are out of balance, and when they're given an opportunity to try to rebalance that in some way, I think that's quite attractive. And there's that lovely quote from Tim Jackson, who's talking about the relentless exposure that we have to advertising the whole time, advertising telling us that we're not smart enough, we're not good enough, we're not sexy enough unless we buy the next gadget. And that's what's driving us to potentially spend more time working to get the money. And Tim Jackson has that lovely bit about saying that we spend money we don't have on things we don't need to make impressions that don't last on people we don't care about, which I think sums it up beautifully. And so there are a lot of forces bearing down on people, which makes it more difficult to make the kinds of changes that we need to. But I think that an awful lot of people would say, not just people in this room, but a lot more people would say, in fact, that quality of life is more important than GDP growth.
Even if they don't translate that into a Green Party vote, which of course...
We'll come to that.
Holly, any thoughts at this stage?
What I think is really interesting here is Caroline's very much identified that politically we have a leadership vacuum. But the beauty is when a vacuum occurs, then something else comes to fill its space. And we're seeing that at a community level. It doesn't necessarily happen in the same place. And you touched on that, Caroline, with the Transition Towns movement. And so it's actually coming from communities, from individuals themselves, taking action, just going ahead and doing. And that in itself, I think, is greatly inspiring. It is also about looking at, what's the future world that we want? And I know that in Bristol here, there's some fantastic dialogue and real kind of leadership in moving forwards with the happiness index, for instance. Do you think our government will ever get to a point where they'll actively endorse that and put it into practice?
I I wouldn't rule it out. I mean, one can be very cynical about why David Cameron chose to wrap himself in some of those policies to kind of detoxify the Tory party, but he did say some quite strong things about gross national well-being rather than GDP growth. I mean, it's, the trouble is that they are caught like rabbits in the headlights of the deficit problem, and are completely responding in the wrong way, in the sense that when we've got a national deficit, when it makes sense for individuals perhaps to spend less when they're overdrawn, if a whole country starts to spend less, then we get even deeper into the recession. What you need is the investment. And if only the government could see that there is absolutely no contradiction between getting out of the deficit and massive investment in a green economy. It's precisely through that investment in the green economy we create the jobs, we get the taxes going back into the revenue, and we stabilise an economy. And it's just a tragedy that they don't see that.
Brilliant. Great.
Okay. I'll go around this way.
You're going to go around the back.
Didn't think of that.
Carefully designed.
Right, hello. I'm really here as the author of this book called Ecological Ethics, an Introduction. And you can read it if you want more than I can give you in 15 minutes. Actually, I was so concerned when I was preparing this not to overrun 15 minutes. I think I've got it down to about 5. I'm sorry if that happens, but maybe in the course of questions I get a bit more time. So it's an honor to be here with these two speakers. I'd like also put in a word of thanks for Nick Hart-Davies for the whole thing. Both Caroline and Polly are doing extremely important work, as you know. And a lot of that work, obviously, particularly in Caroline's case, focuses on policies. And policies are extremely important. But I would say at the same time, without diminishing that importance, they're driven by ethics. And ethics in turn are based on values. The question, well, what do we value most? The policies of Cameron and Blair and so on aren't based on a lack of ethics or values. They're based on pathological ethics and values. So ethics and values, I want to convey to you, are not some kind of fluffy optional extra that we can dispense with. Okay? They have very, very practical and precise consequences. Now the key question then is there's many key questions, but one of them is, in this context of what we're here for today, is do we, as individuals and collectively, value the natural world? And when I say the natural world, I like to use the phrase, the more than human natural world. Because what that means is, it includes us, we are part of the natural world, but it includes a great deal more than just us. Okay? If you value this living whole, the more than human natural world, and its parts, the name of that kind of valuing or that kind of philosophy is ecocentrism. Eco, the old Greek word really for household, okay? And so the center of your values is not just human beings, it's the entire natural world, including human beings. If your values are only human, in the sense that you think that only human beings really matter and are the source of value, the word for that philosophy is anthropocentric. Now, there's many problems with anthropocentrism. Two big ones are, it ignores, ethically speaking, it's not very admirable. It ignores the needs and desires and the rights and the suffering of all the non-humans that we share the earth with. And pragmatically, the problem is that we are, as a matter of fact, completely dependent upon and interdependent with those beings and the earth as a whole. So focusing only on human needs narrows our attention very dangerously. We're prone to short-term behavior, short-term perceptions. We're prone to selfish behavior anyway. And an anthropocentric approach to things, seeing only that kind of value, makes that problem still worse. If our starting point is the well-being of the earth and our fellow creatures on it, we are much more likely, I think, to end up with policies that are at least halfway to promoting what's truly sustainable as well as what is truly humane. Now, I argue in my book, to oversimplify a bit, that ethics also are either ecocentric or anthropocentric. So, ecocentric ethics recognize that we live in a world of relationships with many kinds and many individual beings, subjects, agents, agendas, by no means only human ones, and that this living world is far too vast and complex to be controlled successfully by us. If you live in that kind of world, things have to be negotiated. You're not the master here. You're on a fundamentally equal footing with a lot of other beings, with their agendas, okay? Things have to be negotiated and use has to be sensitive. Anthropocentric ethics, however, license treating the world as simply an insensible set of resources. I've got a little alarm that goes off every time I hear the word resources, okay? And that includes human resources. The world is not simply an inert set of resources which are there to be exploited and managed solely for our benefit. Okay? That is the dominant philosophy of capital and the state and technoscience, which make up the modern empire. I find it kind of interesting that almost none of us start out our lives seeing the world that way. Have you noticed that children do not see the world as a set of resources? We are taught to see the world that way. We are trained to see it that way. We learn to do so. What actually comes naturally is recognizing and delighting in, as well as fearing, creatures of all kinds, as other people, not human people, but other people nonetheless. And not just animals. We relate to places that way, and ecosystems. An old forest feels alive because it is. When it has been clear cut, it feels not just dead, but murdered, because it has been. So, in this situation that we're in, I think there's two things that are especially urgent for us to try and do. One of them is to recognize and resist the way environmentalism is currently being appropriated by corporations and the state. Okay? Particularly with respect to energy, certain so-called wind farms, geoengineering, carbon trading is unbelievable, what's going on there, converting the entire natural world into a one-dimensional concept, carbon, which can then be traded for enormous profits. GMOs, food policies, all these areas. I would just say, please don't be fooled. Business as usual is a massive part of what has got us into this mess, and a green coat of paint on it changes nothing. This situation that we're in has a kind of weird double aspect. One is the eco-crisis, not only global warming, which is enormous, but several other ones, human overpopulation, biodiversity crash, pollution, and the loss of wild, that is to say, relatively wild, habitat to so-called developing. And all this, so far as I know, well, to put it optimistically, is not improving, and in many cases is worsening. But at the same time, weirdly, in response, the official response to this is, let's have more of the same. Let's winch up, let's ramp up the industrial mega machine. Let's make it more sophisticated, okay? And let's extend it to other areas of life that it didn't have a place in before. In this respect, what's happening, I think, in and to Greece is a microcosm not of Europe, but of everywhere. Austerity is, to some extent, another word for asset stripping. And capital is now basically starting to eat its own children. Great response to an ecological crisis, isn't it? So in addition to trying to recognize all this, not be fooled by greenwash, and resist it, I think the other thing that we urgently need to do is to be on the positive side, as Caroline said, to encourage and coordinate ecocentric values and the corresponding ethics that might result in enough pressure being generated to move us towards appropriate, sustainable, truly sustainable policies. I think 3 areas stand out where we could be positive in this way, where we could put our energy into to good effect. One is radically greening education. Why is it possible for children to go to school and never find out where their food comes from? The quality of the water that they're drinking. Never to experience, except with maybe with their parents or maybe not, but in terms of the school, not to experience a at least semi-wild habitat. Meet some animals in the flesh. You know, a tiger on a TV screen has only 2 dimensions. It's not the same thing, okay? Fence, fine, or wild animals that we live with in this part of the world, okay? So greening education, there's so much that could be done there. Secondly, greatly strengthening institutions and practices of green citizenship, encouraging practices of citizenship. This is not a narrowly or explicitly political thing. It's like, well, what do you do? How do you live if you're a good citizen in green terms? How can we encourage that? How can we discourage, because that's the other 50%, is you have to discourage practices of bad green citizenship, dumping, littering, polluting, etc., okay? And thirdly, that's maybe just my point of view, but while I recognize how important politics is, policies, as I say, I think the more energy at the moment that we can put into citizens' movements, that we can, the better. Because as I see it, citizens' movements of all kinds, somebody mentioned the Transition Town movement as an example. There's many other examples. And they're not all necessarily explicitly green. The slow food movement, for example, is brilliant. And it's not specifically ecological. There's many other kinds of that. More energy we can put into that, the better, because these are precisely the movements that are most resistant to being co-opted by big business, big science, and big government. And as I see it, that's where the most hope for successful resistance, as well as salvaging what is good about what we've got, and how strengthening it and renewing our society on its basis, that's where the hope lies. How am I doing? 3. If I can only leave you with one thought, it would be something like, I would like it to be something like this. A truly sustainable human culture is one that is based on ecological sustainability, which in turn requires ecocentrism. Because a way of life that recognizes only human needs and values will never be sustainable. Only a non-human nature whose flourishing in its own terms is permitted and even encouraged will do the job. Nature won't flourish if it's only allowed to do so within the narrow range of things that suit us, of ways that suit our immediate needs, okay? So what is needed is ways of life that respect and love nature and recognize its intrinsic value, not its use value. Not what use is it to us, that's not the question to be asked in this context. Its intrinsic value, okay, as a whole. So the conclusion seems to me to be quite clear. Any way of life, any philosophy, any set of values that is only concerned with humans will fail both humans and the rest of life in the end. Okay, thank you very much.
Holly, that's right up your street, really.
Oh, very much so, very much so. I was very intrigued by what you had to say about negotiations. This is something that I think the world has taken and accepted as a norm, that we actually subject the earth and its environment to negotiations. And to me, this seems a madness. The earth is not up for negotiation. I was very interested in the fact that you were identifying this as premised on a wrong value basis. I think that's absolutely right.
Yeah. The problem I have is with this sort of assumption that we are the masters here. The master species. It's actually this close to we are the master race, we are the master gender. It's the same sort of mentality, and it all hangs together. And I just think we have to subvert that every possible way, including, by the way, having a lot more women MPs, because there is a masculinist dimension to that mentality, which is very important.
So, Patrick, I have to ask you, do you think the Green Party is an ecocentric party?
Great. I feel a lot of sympathy for Green parties everywhere because they're caught between these two imperatives. They're very aware of the ecocentric, pardon me, generalizing it like this, it's incredible liberty. But anyway, they're very aware of ecocentrism, but they also need to get elected. And if you can find your way through those two often conflicting imperatives, I have nothing but admiration.
You're going to ask me something, aren't you?
No, I'm going to ask you how ecocentric you think the Green Party is.
I think if you looked at the Green Party's manifesto, you would say that is an ecocentric manifesto. I think if you look at some of the ways in which we operate, we are guilty of not always bringing that into the public domain, and it's incredibly difficult to get the right language with which to do it. And I struggle with this all the time. You get 30 seconds on the Today programme, and trying to condense what you've said into 30 seconds. I mean, I'd love to ask you later, because it would be great to have it, but you can just see how it's going to get distorted. I can see the headlines already the next day, Greens say go love bunnies or something. You can just see it. And so it's how you find that language, and I think that's something that the movement struggled with so hard. And I was really struck by what you were talking about, intrinsic value. And I think it's so important to go back to that, because in our understandable desire to try to put a value on nature, to stop the roads going through it or whatever, we've led ourselves into a bit of a blind alley, because you only have to change those economic figures a little bit, and it demonstrates that we're not talking about intrinsic value. But if you don't do it, then it can be hard too.
It's a real bind, but what strikes me is that if you do agree to assigning an economic value to everything, you are leaving the final say to economics.
Yeah.
And that's a devil's bargain, in my opinion.
Which says, please point remote at the apple on your left to change the slide. Where's the apple? Oh, okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Wonderful. So let's see if we can do this. My slide is already there and I haven't even pressed anything. Well, first of all, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's an absolute delight to be here. Of course, I'm here to talk about the International Law of Ecocide, which I have, if I press this right, I have proposed into the United Nations. This is a law that when I had one of those light bulb moments. In fact, I was actually speaking on a platform in Copenhagen at the climate negotiations, pondering the very fact that here we were negotiating on something that I really disagreed with. And someone in fact said, we need a new language to deal with this problem. Here we're causing mass damage and destruction to the earth and to ecosystems. We need new language to deal with this. And it was one of those, literally those light bulb moments when you sit there and you say, yes, it's ecocide, it's like genocide. That should be a crime. That should be a crime. My God, that should be a crime. And it literally took me down a rabbit hole of intense legal scrutiny. Could that actually be an international crime? And I went down that rabbit hole for about 3 months. And I eventually came up for air, and what I decided was that not only can this be an international crime, but in fact we could move very fast, and it really would change the rules of the game, so to say, in a very big way. Rules of the game are actually what life is all about. It's how we govern ourselves. We could call that rules of the game. But I just want to take you back a step. One of the things that I did as a good lawyer is I went back to first principles. What do we already have in place as international law, international crime? And what we already have are 4 international crimes. They are crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide, crimes of aggression. That's the precursor to war, the run-up to it. The first 3 were put in place in 1948 as a result, direct result of our response to World War II. Believe it or not, genocide was not a crime before that. Think how hard it is to speak out about something when it doesn't have a name. It can be very difficult. Now, those 4 international crimes, crimes of aggression was just signed off, so to say, back in 2010. So this is a growing area of law, international law, that's developing. And I say that what we're needing to do is expand our cycle of concern. Those first 4 are predominantly, not entirely, but predominantly to do with human-to-human engagement. In fact, they're predicated on something quite special, the sacredness of life, the recognition that life itself is precious. Predominantly human life, that's what's being looked at here. But I say, in fact, we need to expand that cycle of concern out to all life, not just human life, but life of all beings. And that we're missing a 5th international crime against peace, and that is ecocide. The importance of this is, of course, it's based on the intrinsic values, the basic understanding that we are all interconnected and interdependent. Destroy the very earth that we walk on, and we destroy our ability to live in peaceful enjoyment on this land. But more than that, not only do I have the right to life, but surely the earth has that right too. And how do we impose duties and obligations and responsibilities on those who make the decisions as to what is happening to our lives and to the lives of all beings? So this is where the international law of ecocide comes into place. It's slightly counterintuitive to go this way to turn a slide. No, I've done it wrong. Okay, here we are. This was a back end of an envelope scribble that arose out of climate negotiations when I was trying to understand and make sense of what was going on. And what I realized was that we had a hermetically sealed cycle of damage and destruction, which I call ecocide, and I'll come back to that word in a moment. And it leads to, amongst other things, what's known as resource depletion. And I agree very much with what Patrick was saying about that word resource. It's a word of disconnect in its own right, because actually when we see something as a resource, we tend to put a price tag on it. The thing is when we start seeing problems with resource depletion, then we can end up with conflict, and that can ultimately lead to war. And in fact, we've already had 2 wars over resources. Darfur was a war over water, Iraq was a war over oil. Now, that cycle, hermetically sealed cycle of damage and destruction, it's spiraling onwards and upwards, faster and faster and faster. And we know that. There are statistics, there's evidence to demonstrate that. The Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity report back in 2010 did a very good number crunching exercise to demonstrate that. And they looked at the top 3,000 corporations, and what they saw there was that for the year 2008, those top 3,000 corporations were causing $2.2 trillion of damage and destruction just in that one year. 2009, it was anticipated to be almost double that again, 4 trillion, and 2010, almost double again. So somewhere along the line, we're looking at one of those hockey stick graphs that's just going faster and steeper onwards and upwards. So it's not a matter of slowing down that cycle of damage and destruction. It's a matter of stopping it in its tracks, halting it, disrupting it. And that's what an international law of ecocide can do. Now, you'll have heard of the term disruptor technologies. A disruptor technology is an innovation that comes in completely left field, and it actually shifts our values, and it shifts the way we live, literally overnight. A very good example of that is the internet. Look at how that has shifted the way we actually interact with life itself over the last 10 years alone. Ecocide has the potential to change things that big. Nope. Yeah. So this is the beginnings of the definition that's been proposed into the United Nations. I just want to break it down a little bit. So I'm saying that ecocide is a crime where we have extensive destruction and damage to or loss of ecosystems. There are two different types of ecocide. But possibly the most important word here in this definition is the word inhabitants, to such an extent that peaceful enjoyment by the inhabitants of that territory has been severely diminished. It doesn't say by those people, by those human beings. It's a recognition that if you look at any given territory, it's not just human beings that live there, but that we have many other species as well. And that's what's so important. It's about expanding that cycle of concern. It's about understanding what is ecocide. There are two different types of ecocide at play here. So you'll see in the screen on the left-hand side, there's human-made ecocide, ascertainable ecocide. We can actually identify as a result of human activity. This is largely corporate ecocide, where we're looking at mass damage and destruction as a result of certain corporate activity, certain industries, mining, fossil fuel extraction, fracking, deforestation. In fact, one ecocide that actually played out literally just 3 weeks after this was submitted into the United Nations was the BP Gulf oil spill. But there is another type of ecocide, and that's naturally occurring ecocide. And it's very important that we recognise this and legislate as well. That's when we see mass ecosystem collapse as a result of maybe tsunamis, rising sea levels, floods, melting ice. Anything that causes huge catastrophe to a given area, territory. And we're seeing that this is happening at an ever-increasing basis, ever-increasing rate, and that it's largely unpredictable. And we're unable really to identify when or how it could happen. But in some instances, we do know that some of it's around the corner. Now, in climate negotiation terms, this is very important because we have the likes of the Maldives standing there, putting up their hand and saying, help us, we're just about to go underwater. And what happens is governments turn away, literally look away and say, not my problem. That's because there is no legal duty of care to give assistance. And I say it's very important that we create an international law that imputes a legal duty of care, not just on corporations, or more specifically, not just on the individuals who are actually making those decisions within those corporations, but also upon our governments, heads of state, ministers, who make decisions as to what happens and what assistance can be given, and who make decisions that can have adverse impact on humanity, but also who make decisions that could give assistance and create and help as to where we should go next. Oh, sorry, I'm not mastering this terribly well at all. I wish to take you just back very quickly to 200 years ago. I think there are lessons that we can learn when we look back to the time of William Wilberforce. Because what happened there was that William Wilberforce stood up at a time when it was the norm to have slaves. And he stood up and he said something very unusual. He said, in fact, we have to stop this. Now, what he argued was that it's a moral imperative that we have to stop this, that the moral imperative trumps the economic imperative. This is about the ethics, the values. Why is it that just by dint of someone being black that we should have them in chains? Now, when he came along and he argued that we should end slavery, abolish slavery, he was met with a complete wall of objections. Industry turned around and they said, you can't do that, it's a necessity. In fact, get rid of slaves, we will have economic collapse right across the board. Moreover, the public demand this. In fact, why don't you leave us to resolve this problem? We already have too many laws. Allow us to do this voluntarily. We'll put in place our own self-regulation. But when push came to the shove, they said, well, you know, if we really do have to put some kind of rules in place here, well, why don't we cap the numbers of slaves that are coming over in the boats. And we could create an internal trading system here. In effect, you know, tradable cap and trade system. Now that was actually laughed out of Parliament. In fact, one industry insider proposed, well, why don't we just actually ask everyone to use their slaves a little less? Kind of energy efficiency argument, if you will. Just human energy. But William Wilberforce wasn't for that. He was saying, no, morally, in and of itself, this is wrong. And what's so amazing is that if we look to the comparator to today, what we're seeing is that those same arguments, okay, this really is flummoxing me, those same arguments are the same. It's just the picture that changes, really. In essence, we've enslaved the planet. We've tried all of this. We've tried those proposals. They haven't worked. The beauty is that, of course, by trying them and seeing that it's not working, that we're causing even more damage and destruction, allows for thinking, allows for big ideas to come in from the margins, because that's where big ideas always start. They start at the margins and then they move into the centre space. And we believe that actually there's a window of opportunity opening here, where here there is the opportunity for a very different thinking and engaging on this issue, so that we can actually change, quite literally, change the rules of the game. This is the book that I've just brought out, and it sets out why Earth is our business. Not just the realms of the corporate world, but Earth is all of our business. What I'm proposing is really, truly innovative. There is no one else out there actually proposing that we use law in this creative way, which actually drives forward intrinsic values at the heart of it. This is really about caring for people and planet and prioritising people and planet over and above profit. Now, I'm not anti-profit, not at all. And I genuinely believe when we put people and planet first, then profit will flourish. But it will flourish out of innovation in a very different direction. One that is no longer damaging and destructive. And quite literally, the earth is in our hands. It's up to us what we decide to do here. So what we've done is we've put out a call for a bold visionary leader to step forward. We're actually putting a call out into the business world and calling for someone to take up the biggest job on earth. Because when Wilberforce stood up and shouted for the abolition of slavery, it wasn't just him that made that happen. It had to come from different quarters, different arenas as well. And there was a groundswell. But there was one other man who helped change the rules of the game back then. And his name was Charles Grant. Charles Grant was the biggest chief executive of his day. He was the chief executive of the British East India Company. And he stood up and he did something truly remarkable, because he said, slavery is wrong, it must stop. And I support the call for laws to abolish that. Now when he did that, he did two things. He gave permission for other heads of industry to stand up and speak out as well. But more than that, government listened and they took action. So we're asking for people to nominate or put themselves forward for the biggest job on earth. We think there's a leadership vacuum there that needs to be filled. So I'm asking you, please do visit whoischarlesgrant.com and nominate either yourself or someone else you know to take on the biggest job on earth. Thank you very much.
How do you think a crime of ecocide would go down in Westminster, Caroline?
Well, Polly came to a meeting, didn't you, that was organised by Michael Meacher and about half a dozen of us, I think, which was a cross-party meeting. I mean, obviously it was self-selecting, but I mean, I think it struck a chord. I mean, I suppose all of this is going to be about transition, isn't it, in a way, in the sense that I can perfectly accept that we can make a strong case to say that if we were to value things in the way you describe, that profits will flourish, but in a different, more innovative way. But it's how we argue that in the transition. I'm trying to think about how that translates into, you know, for example, the efforts just now to expand Lydd Airport, and you've got the RSPB saying, no, you're going to ruin these really, really precious habitats. And you know, I'm sure you're right that if we weren't to build the airport, and I'm absolutely adamant that we shouldn't build the airport, but it's more difficult to persuade people of that when you've got a very concrete example in front of them than it is at a time when it's more abstract. But I just wanted to ask you, actually, I was interested that the two people, Wilberforce and Charles Grant, were the ones who spoke out. And this isn't a flippant question, but do we know anything about, was there a Mrs. Wilberforce? Was there a Mrs. Grant? Do we know if there was any interaction going on? I would love to think that actually it's Mrs. Wilberforce saying, oh, go on.
What do you?
William Wilberforce actually had a very successful marriage. He met his wife, and in fact, the very first day that I believe it was the very first day they met, they stayed up talking all night. It is apparently on record. They stayed and talked, and he announced that they were going to get married, and they did within 3 weeks. And they went on to, I think, I have 7 children. So she was kept out of the limelight for most of it, busy with child rearing. We're talking 200 years ago when women didn't feature big. But William Wilberforce was a remarkable man. Even his most vociferous opponents would turn up to hear him speak. Apparently he had a most beautiful voice, and he was much enjoyed as a public speaker at that time. And so he was one of these people that greatly engaged society as a whole at a time when we didn't have television in any event, but also engaged society. He had the most eclectic set of friends, and really wide-ranging as well, which made the difference. And that seeded it out into the communities and different backgrounds, different sectors. He was not someone who remained in his castle, so to say, and kept away from the public at large. He was a people's man of his time, yeah. And he had a good woman behind him.
7 children. Patrick.
Well, I just think it's striking the way Wilberforce insisted that slavery was morally or ethically wrong. In other words, he didn't say, well, there's a problem with profitability here. He moved the discussion onto a different terrain in which somebody like him could have an effect. Yeah. And I think it's not the only thing we need in the eco-crisis, but it certainly would be a helpful move. I also applaud what you say, that change comes from the margins. That's certainly been my experience as well. The mainstream centres have too much to lose. So.
Can I ask you a question?
Oh.
Unconventional. Of course, I was about to ask a killer question of Polly, but you go ahead.
No, just in that example, because I'm completely agreeing with what you're saying, but just translating that into day-to-day Westminster life. If you were to go onto an interview and say that we shouldn't expand Lydd Airport because it's morally wrong, I mean, I'm just putting that to you. Would you go on and go up to John Humphreys or Jeremy Paxman and say that? And I'm saying maybe you should. It's a genuine question, and it would but that wouldn't have been my first instinct.
No.
And that's maybe the wrong thing. So it's a genuine question. But if we're really to be serious about what you're saying, and we're not just talking about it academically, but are we really saying that is the argument we would put in that circumstance?
I think it's very improbable that one would start with that position, because I think I would be doing the same as you. I'd be calculating, how can I make the most of this period of time I've got to win over as many people to the most sensible course of action available to us? And I'd think, what's the argument that's going to do that? And I'd probably make a judgment that the more eco-centric I got in my pitch, the less persuasive my advocacy would be. And that, I think, is our dilemma.
That's the bind, yeah.
That's what it is.
Yeah.
Polly, just very quickly, while we start getting the microphones going, okay. So I've got this vision of one of the large mining companies arraigned in a court of law somewhere in The Hague or something, with the crime of ecocide being leveled against them. I'm curious to know if you would then require every single person who had made use of the products of this mining company to be standing behind them, complicit in the ecocidal guilt of this mining company.
Well, that's a very good question. In fact, what this touches upon is the principle of what's known of superior responsibility that applies to international crime. So what that means is that people who are in a position of superior responsibility, those who are in command and control. So we're looking at CEOs, we're looking at directors. In fact, 10 countries already have a crime of ecocide on their criminal penal codes. Now, we only actually found this out relatively recently, and there is a case currently going on at the moment where a CEO of a mining company is on charges for ecocide. This is happening just now in Kyrgyzstan. Now, you may laugh because it seems like a random country, but it's maybe actually no surprise in some ways that Kyrgyzstan and other countries have this law. It tends to be that those are countries, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Belarus, have now got ecocide on their criminal codes because they have actually been the recipients of ecocide as a result of nuclear testing. So they know how this can play out in a very big way. Wow. And the very first country to put it in place was in fact Vietnam, which is very telling. Yeah.
Very telling. Well, thank you. Good. Okay, so we've got plenty of time now for Q&A. I'm going to take little clusters of questions, which of course won't necessarily cohere in the way that I would like them to, but we'll just take a bit of a risk on that. So if you could say who you are, because I think it's quite nice for our speakers to know who you are so they can respond to you personally if they want to, without being ad hominem about it. And I'm going to start with one hand at the back here, and then I've got another hand over here, and then I've got a hand down the front here. And we'll take all three. And if you can be nice and snappy, that's always better, as you know. So, right.
Martin Big, Bristol Green Capital. With the shrinking of the state and the need for leadership, is it now time for cities like Bristol and the communities in Bristol to take a far stronger leading role in meeting the green challenges that the panel identified?
That's not a leading question, obviously. Okay, we got our second question here. We got the third one down the front here, please. Thank you.
Do the panel and the chair see any significant long-term future for individually commissioned photovoltaic systems, given the recent and proposed changes in the feed-in tariff? And what do these changes imply about the government's attitude to renewable energy?
Okay, now look, I'm going to be really bossy, and please don't get me wrong, because I know that Caroline will be only too happy to answer that question when she's signing books at the end. I'd like to try and keep this at the level of ethics. I know it's tricky, but do you mind if you have a solo response, as it were, from Caroline later on, or me? Even, I'm quite happy to answer that one. But I do want to try and keep us up here. This ethical stuff often gets slipped down the agenda, so let's try and keep focused on the ethics we can, even in Bristol. That would be really good. I mean, the Bristol dimension, I meant, sorry. I did not mean that ethics is harder in Bristol, or anything. Please.
Thanks. I'm Jenny Collins, speaking in a personal capacity, but I currently work at the Soil Association, formerly of Friends of the Earth. It's a question for Polly, really. I'm absolutely fascinated and kind of blown away by this ecocide idea, but it makes me question what sort of punishment will these kind of chief execs be facing, and what do we think will actually deter them? Because I think we've seen BP face some huge financial fine for the oil spill, but really, did it even impact on their bottom line? What will deter them in terms of bringing that law to justice?
Okay, let's start with the Bristol bit, and then we'll come on to that specifically. Caroline, do you want to start on time for cities to get going?
Well, absolutely, I think it's time for cities to get going, and I think Bristol would be extremely well placed to take a lead on that. I mean, you've got so many green organisations here. You're going for the European Green Capital. You're having this wonderful Green Week. And I think one of the good things that government is doing, maybe, is to, if they actually deliver on it, is to decentralise more power to cities. And I think some of the initiatives in the localism bill, which will potentially give more powers to local areas to do their own thing and to recognise what kind of investment climate they need, and therefore to be able to do things like varying business rates to encourage, different kinds of businesses and so on. I think there's real potential there. So I think that there's a whole government core cities strategy. I think the government does dimly recognise this, not in quite the same way that we would. I mean, they want to see them as generators of traditional economic growth. But if we've got the powers, we can equally use those to be innovators in well-being, prosperity, values, and all of those other things as well. So I think it's actually one of the very positive signs on the agenda at the moment. There aren't that many, so let's grasp this one, and I would love to see Bristol absolutely doing that and being up there.
Polly, punishments.
You're absolutely right to hit upon fines. I call fines catch me if you can laws. And a lot of environmental legislation is predicated on that, which of course is often very unsatisfactory, because usually those who are most adversely impacted by environmental destruction have neither the wherewithal or the financial wherewithal or the legal wherewithal to bring cases. And if they do, it can take many, many years, if not decades. And even if you do succeed, it's often too little too late. We had the opportunity last year, we held a mock ecocide trial in the UK Supreme Court, where we really put it to the test to see if we took this as an international law, transposed it into a national piece of legislation, what would that look like? And also what sentencing options to put in place. Now, because it's a crime, and an international crime at that, the starting point is a prison sentence. However, what we did was we gave another option to our CEOs. It was 3 counts of ecocide, and the jury convicted on 2 out of 3. And we gave them the option at a separate sentencing hearing to enter into a restorative justice process. And that was something that was very important for quite a lot of international lawyers who are engaged in this arena, to see how that, just locking someone up at the end of the day is not entirely satisfactory. But to enter into a restorative justice process, you have to take responsibility for your actions, and then enter into a system where you actually are hearing, in a roundtable context, the voices of those speaking on behalf of various communities that have been adversely impacted. So we actually had someone speaking on behalf of the earth, for instance, someone speaking on behalf of the birds that had been adversely impacted, someone speaking on behalf of future generations, as well as someone speaking on behalf of the indigenous community that was adversely impacted. And what happened within that space was quite remarkable, because it's a very difficult space to manage, and it's actually testimony. We had one of the UK's leading facilitators in alternate dispute resolution helping us with this. Actually, they started to come to a point where they brought out solutions to move forward. Now, the judge had the capacity to overrule that if he thought it was unsatisfactory, but in fact the judge did rule in favour of that and put in place a system to then go back in another 6 months to see whether or not this really is playing out. Unfortunately, the other CEO declined, so he was sentenced to prison.
Right, thank you. Restorative conservation, oddly enough, that's a bit like the EU Habitats Directive. I mean, if they did ever come to build the airport out in the Thames, the restorative bill to compensate for the damage done to those ecosystems will run into many, many, many billions of pounds, as we know. So there's a sort of built-in process there too. Okay, so I've got a hand at the back there. I'm sort of just trying to keep gender balance, so you're all hopeless. And then I've got a hand here, secondly, and then a hand there. Thank you. That guy at the back there to start with. All the rest of you blokes can just wait a bit, and then...
My name's Simon Roberts. I head up the charity called the Centre for Sustainable Energy. You mentioned Wilberforce. I hate to recommend it, but William Hague, the current Foreign Secretary, has written an absolutely brilliant biography of Wilberforce, which also really charts the struggles they had. So he was a bit of a weirdo when he first started talking about it. And I think I'd recommend it to anyone here to read it over the holiday. It's quite heavy, but actually he's a very good historian and very good writer. So I'd recommend that. My question actually was slightly different. I think there's a kind of sleight of hand going on here. I'm really impressed by the ecocide work, and I think there's a kind of interesting kind of coming in, as you say, from left field. Get it into international law. They'll all assume it'll never really happen. Just nail it, and then we'll start to see how it works out in practice. My question, though, is for everyone: how do you get the ethics actually to trump the economics, so that I can say building Hinkley Point C is immoral, not have to prove that it's too expensive?
Right, that's an excellent question. You're next. Where's this microphone on this? Thank you. And then if you can go to the guy at the back after that, yeah.
Hello, I'm Jenny. I'm wearing a Festival of Nature t-shirt because I'm just helping them out at the moment, but that's my background. I wanted to ask, how do we re-engage the wider public at large with democracy and environmental issues? Patrick mentioned education, but obviously our children can't vote right now, so even if they have the insight, how do we engage those young adults?
Great, and then just a couple of rows back. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Hi, I am Mike Seidler, and I run something called the Happy City Initiative, which is looking to try and create citizen-based change at a city scale. And I'd like to ask, I'm sure all the panel are aware, probably many of you in the room, that happiness is a serious subject backed by neuroscience and psychology these days in ways that perhaps increases our understanding of what it means. The UN are paying attention to it. It will be raised at Rio. And personally, I think that we need to kind of reclaim the term from the idea of the consumer-based idea of happiness, that you will be happy when you've bought the next new thing, to the more deep, meaningful form of happiness which we all crave, this one of relationship. And I think, personally, it's the question which drives directly into this issue of ethics and intrinsic value. And so my question to the panel is, how comfortable do you feel with the term happiness, and are you, given what you know about the subject at the moment, are you planning to use it actively to promote this kind of an agenda?
Can I just ask you, do you think happiness is an anthropocentric word or an ecocentric word?
Personally, I would say that it is ecocentric in its meaning. So whilst you might interpret it in an I can't say the word, people-centered way.
Yep.
Yeah, I think it absolutely, because it's focused on our interdependence. Relationships is the thing about happiness is it's universal. So if you can ask people any way you like about all sorts of things, and they'll give you yes or no answers. I am or I'm not interested. 100% of people will be interested in happiness.
Right. Patrick, let's start with you. Are you a happiness man? And then can you deal with Simon's point about trumping economics?
Am I a happiness man? I have to admit it's not a concept that I've given a lot of thought to, partly because I think it's something that is a byproduct rather than something you can directly go after. When you're doing something that's deeply satisfying, you tend to be happy. But I like the idea that it's not necessarily anthropocentric. Animals just want to be happy. It's very true. I think the Dalai Lama said all beings want to be happy. So I think it's got potential. You're right. It's got potential that I haven't really thought about. So thank you for that. And on the economics, well, it's a bit tricky because I wouldn't like economics to get away with being able to present itself as if it was a different domain than ethics, as if it had nothing to do with ethics, as if ethics weren't involved in economics. So I think dreadful word, critique. An attempt to focus in on what are the ethical implications of this particular economic program, which you can cash out in, pardon me, terrible metaphor, which you can flesh out in terms of how many people benefit from this, who's benefiting, who's suffering as a result. You could go a long way that way.
But economics is a science.
Oh, please. Please. In that case, so is astrology. Sorry.
Happiness, re-engagement with the public. I mean, I think this is a really important story. We started about this. How does this first question came up, groundswell. We're all being honest here. We're not part of a groundswell. We're part of a movement, but in our more ruthlessly analytical moments, I doubt many of you get up in the morning saying, the groundswell is going to sweep me up this morning. It's not quite groundswell start time yet, is it? So how do we deal with Jenny's question? Why aren't we in a groundswell? I'm feeling I need a groundswell.
You know, I feel a groundswell. I wake up and I feel happy.
That's different.
But I do feel a groundswell. I actually think there's something going on here. I think we're moving into a sort of I call it, in fact, a term that someone spoke about the other day, dynamic emergence. I think there is something shifting here, something's changing. The narrative that I'm hearing on the margins is growing, it's getting louder, it's getting bigger, and it is about intrinsic values and ethics. Now, yes, I can give you a business case for ecocide. That's not why I'm here today. I'm here to talk about the ethics, and actually people are getting more comfortable about talking about this. Talking about ethics within the last 15 years was just largely devoid from being in there in the political arena, but we are starting to hear about this. You know, when I was in Durban for the climate negotiations back in December, what we had was the finance minister in South Africa standing up saying we need bold, moral, courageous leadership. That's a finance minister that's saying that. So something's going on here, and we're starting to hear, you know, leadership within the world of faith leaders. We're starting to hear it from youths, and it's going to be interesting to see what actually is coming from the margins, even next week at the Rio Earth Summit. I think there is a dynamic emergence. Something is shifting, something is moving. I don't quite know where it'll go or what'll happen here. But once people start, there's a kind of collective consciousness that's not driven by fear, but actually driven by happiness. And happiness is just a kind of manifestation of love, really, it put into practice. And something very beautiful can happen.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. And if you look a bit wider, then you could argue that lots of what was happening with the Arab Spring was a huge uprising of people certainly feeling groundswell and movement. And even closer to home, you know, they managed in Germany to get, you know, big demonstrations on the streets against nuclear power. I don't still quite understand why we don't get that here, but still we don't. But it's still, so I mean, I agree with you. There are things going on out there that we can tap into. I mean, what's happening in Greece, you know, the kind of anger that's on the streets there. Now, I know that's for a different reason, but I think people are beginning to get the idea again that they can make a difference. And that has been one of the most toxic legacies of Mrs. Thatcher and probably before that. You know, that sense that there is no alternative, you can't make any difference, so don't bother. That is the most dangerous message that people ever get to hear. And the more, by looking around us, we can see that different communities are making a difference, and that you're standing up and speaking out, you know, is part of an effective movement, then I think we're more likely to see that kind of groundswell. So I do feel fairly optimistic on that, actually. I think we could see something.
And trumping the dark science of economics, very quickly.
Doing it quickly isn't easy. I mean, I think it comes down to language and education, and I'm still puzzling over the thing I asked you when we're both deciding, are we going to say that aviation expansion or indeed nuclear power is immoral? And maybe there is an argument for getting more of that language back in the discourse again, because it's, as you say, we've not been using that language. It hasn't been used for a long time, and maybe it's about time to come back to that.
Yeah, that would certainly trump economics. So I'm staring out at a sea of relatively happy faces, other than the fact that we are about to come to an end, because we're sort of very close to our conclusion. How would you all feel if we did 10 more minutes? Would this be okay? Are you all comfortable about that? Excellent. So we'll take 10 more minutes if that's right. But it does mean we're going to have to be really punchy and short, and that means you're going to have to be really punchy and short. So I've got a hand down here, and I've got a hand right at the back here, and then I've got, no, you're the wrong gender, sorry, and then I've got another hand here too. So this guy here at the front, and then the lady at the back, please, and then we'll come to you.
My question is much nearer home. I live in a listed building, and English Heritage tells me I can't install double glazing because it might reflect the wrong way, and I can't install photovoltaic panels, although they look like the original slates, because they don't look quite right. Okay. This is as silly as the honours system, where people get given knighthoods and OBs because how eminent they are and how long they've been there.
Are there any architects in the audience this evening? Are there any planners in the audience this evening?
Oh dear.
Yes. At the end, sir, would you go and engage with this gentleman when he's not engaging with Caroline, because he was the one who was asking about feed-in tariffs. So you two could engage to begin with, and then you'll be sorted, if that's okay. Sorry, but ethical double glazing, I think, is a bit tricky. Right, at the back here.
Hello, thank you. My name's Claire Hiddine, and I just want to extend on Polly's introduction of a term that I've been working with, which is dynamic emergence. And I've been exploring this, especially the relationship between ethics and economics and the way we treasure the rational over the more intuitive, felt sense of experiencing. And I just think it's really important that we become more familiar with the concept that we are not an isolated speck of finiteness, but that we are an always emerging phenomena that occurs between people and between environments and between species. So I just wanted to put my name on that because that's going to be on the book. So thank you.
Okay, excellent. So we've got one more. So could you bring your microphone down to the front here, and then can I see one more hand? 9, that's very helpful. So would you mind coming to this lady here, please, and then we'll go to, yes, the gentleman at the back. No, right at the back. Right.
Just a last point, just to begin with, about William Wilberforce. Of course, although he was remarkably successful, we have to also acknowledge that there are infinitely more slaves in the world now than there ever were at his time. And I'm afraid my comments are rather gloomy altogether. My lasting impression of this week was given to me at the very beginning of the week when I listened to Clive Hamilton talking about eco-engineering. And he made a very powerful argument for this being by far the most likely dominant paradigm to succeed in our world. And the discussant to this paper was Jonathan. And my question is therefore to you, Jonathan, because your initial reaction was to hold your head in your hands and to say, what hope is there after hearing that for the deep ecology movement? And in fact, you asked the audience, were they more depressed now than they had been when they came? And 75% of the audience put their hands up. So my question to you is, can you now convince me after this wonderful week we've had, that in fact that dominant paradigm is not going to be successful?
Okay, thank you very much for that. So we've got the gentleman there. Yes, this is the last one, I'm afraid.
Hi, my name's Mike Thomas. I'm from Permanent Culture now. Basically, if we see the environment as a commons, because there's a commons movement which is growing now, where stuff should be held in common. What I see happening now is an enclosure like we've never seen before. You have governments enclosing absolutely everything. They're trying, the corporations in conjunction with governments enclosing the internet, water supplies, land grabs, all this sort of stuff. Now, when we had the enclosures in the 16th century in this country, which is the beginning of all this mess, really, we had armed uprisings and resistance. And my question would be, when does it come to the point, ethically, when that has to happen?
Then the groundswell becomes a tidal wave. So, Polly, just before you answer that one explicitly, could you just give us a little insight into the notion of the commons? Because that is a very powerful idea. It hasn't actually cropped up yet this evening explicitly, so thank you for putting that into the domain, because in a way, you're really talking about crimes against the commons, the natural commons, as it were. Is that part of the emerging
dialogue? The dynamic emergence. Yes, there's a huge engagement around this idea of viewing the earth as a living being, something that should be entrusted to future generations, not through ownership principles, but trusteeship principles. And this is really about that shift, that dramatic shift from property and ownership laws to trusteeship laws. So how we actually move from viewing the earth as the thing that we commoditize, we put a price tag on, and actually moving to viewing the earth as a living being where we take responsibility. That's absolutely crucial here. And this is part of how I'm seeing and I'm hearing, there's a kind of converging narrative. We're talking about viewing the earth as a global commons, and in fact there's a lot of discourse around this in the United Nations now. We're also hearing about sacred economics. Charles Eisenstein's a very exciting guy in this field that really is talking about how we shift our understanding about economics as a whole. And this is also kind of tying in, well, we need an international court for the environment. And in fact, Caroline, you yourself have talked about a commissioner for the environment as well. So we're starting to hear ideas. We've got an ombudsman for future generations in Hungary. That's tipping into Rio in its own right. There's a lot of this sense of actually looking towards future generations, looking long term. When we do that, it's far more relational governed. But also this is the power of law. Yes, it's true, we do have hidden slavery. We have girls shipped in from Latvia. Absolutely. That's absolutely right. But that doesn't mean that we should just get rid of slavery laws. And yes, we do have genocide still playing out in different countries, but that doesn't mean we should get rid of the law of genocide. Wouldn't it be weird if we didn't have the law of theft, for instance, and someone stole your bag and you're running down the street and you call a policeman for it, and he says, well, there's nothing I can do about it. Anyone can steal anything here. It's really about standing up and saying, well, and we do this in law when we recognize that the moral imperative needs to be translated into a legal imperative. And it is about actually creating something that can create a governance at an international level that then prioritizes over and above what we already have. Existing law does not do that, and it doesn't use criminality. Amnesty International will not be out of a job tomorrow, absolutely not. But at least they have the tools of the trade to go in and take action. As a barrister, I cannot get into court and represent the earth at this moment, not under existing environmental laws. They are not fit for purpose.
I think the idea of a commons is extremely important. And another way to put it is the common good. If you consider, as I think you must, if you think about it at all honestly and deeply, the earth is the ultimate commons and the ultimate common good, because we are all, it is the source and condition of all life. So how could it not be a commons and the ultimate common good? And the point about a commons is it's not appropriate to be privatized. It's not an issue of private profit. It's an issue of public good, interpreting the word public to mean not just humans, but all the beings that live here and that depend on it. But I think I want to just add one concept here, taking off from the point about intuition that was made by the questioner there, Claire. You see, people won't defend, with respect to Polly, no matter what the legal frameworks are, and no matter what the political frameworks are, and this relates to maybe uprising, people won't defend what they don't love. And the valuing of the earth as a commons means that, in effect, it's sacred. I don't mean in a formal religious sense. It doesn't need to be in a formal religious, although it can be. But the point about if something is sacred, it's not for sale, is it? You don't flog your cathedrals and your whatever, if they really are still sacred. And that's so an inappropriate mode for dealing with the earth. Not just technically inappropriate, it's intuitively, it's spiritually inappropriate, on all these levels.
I very much agree with both of those. And I guess I was coming back to reflect on the issue of at what point does that mean that we tip into a peaceful revolution or marching in the streets or the direct action or whatever. And I think the danger of sitting back and waiting for it to happen, we're all waiting for each other to go out there and do it, and maybe that means that it gets delayed. And so I wanted to just personalize it a little bit more and just talk about how all of us can take personal responsibility for the things that are happening around us that we don't agree with. And that could be either, for example, if the diggers get back at Hinckley and start digging for a new nuclear power station at Hinckley, I will be there and I will be lying down in front of them along with quite a few others, I hope, because I think more nuclear power is immoral. I think, basically generating yet more nuclear waste for future generations is immoral. A very different kind of example, it sounds a bit of a silly one. I was trying to think of the woman's name. She was the woman newsreader, partner of Claire Balding, who was in the news recently because she was in a traffic queue and somebody in the car in front of them threw a crisp packet out of the window. So because the traffic wasn't moving, she got out of her car, went over and threw it back into the window with the people who'd thrown it out, and was just commenting about how surprised they looked. But that's a small, silly example, but it's, how many of us wouldn't do that? And I think that taking responsibility and recognizing that we are it, that it's not going to happen from somewhere else, it's going to happen from us as individuals, all added up together. I think that is some hope that we will then get more of a culture of taking that kind of direct action now.
Right, so I obviously have not forgotten your question to me personally, but happily I can combine two things in one here by not answering your question, and yet by announcing what will in effect be the 7th Schumacher lecture of the Big Green Week, and this has been the 6th, which is tomorrow evening at 6 o'clock. And if you come along and listen to that one as well, this is a bit of a tease, I have to admit, I will try and answer your question, because yes, we started on a slightly gloomy note with Clive, but I want to end on an upbeat note tomorrow. And you'll also have the privilege of listening to John Elkington, Felicity Hartnett, who's with us here this evening, the wonderful Michael Paulin, who is a leading architect doing biomimicry, just sort of brilliant stuff, along the themes of zero noughts, people who are going to zero in terms of their impact on the earth. And Matt Harvey as well, of course, our wonderful poet. So, thank you, everybody. That's a tremendous evening. I'm really very grateful to all of you for those questions, which is brilliant. Can I just conclude by thanking our sponsors again this evening, Triodos and Good Energy and Wessex Water. I hope that those companies sort of get a bit of a buzz at the way in which these ethical dimensions can begin to make a difference in their lives as well as in the lives of citizens today. I'm very struck by what Patrick said there right at the end. People won't defend what they don't love, and we had a very powerful example of that last year when people did stand up to defend what they did love, namely their woodlands and forests, when very few people thought that they would, including the government, and I'm sorry to say, including most NGOs. But people knew better. They absolutely knew that that was part of what they loved in their life. And the idea that this was somehow going to become an ownership story for the government and all the rest of it was just too horrendous. So we have it in us to be insurrectionary, to stand up when we want to. And I think it's very powerful on occasions like this that we actually hear that and can remind ourselves of this power that's in each one of us individually, and even more so when we start thinking of ourselves as part of that wider movement. So thank you all very much. But obviously, most importantly tonight, thank you to our three speakers. Fantastic evening. They are all now raring to sign books at the back or answer technical questions about photovoltaics or double glazing. Caroline probably will spend more time on that because she tells me that her book is at least a decade out of date, so you may feel that it's no longer current enough to warrant your attention, in which case come and listen to a little teach-in on double glazing in historic houses. So that's it for this evening. Thank you very much, everybody. It's fantastic. Thank you.